Welcome to CriolloWise podcast, the evolution of the Criollo breed around the world.
All right, so today we're going deep on horse bits. You know, it's funny, for those of us who aren't riding every single day, it can feel like a foreign language sometimes.
It really can.
You step into a tack shop and it's just like, whoa, like where do I even begin with all these different options? But we all know bits are how we communicate with our horses.
They're essential.
Right, it's the core of the partnership, so we got to get it right.
Yeah.
So maybe we can just start with the basics. I know there are like snaffle bits and leverage bits, but beyond those names, I'm a little fuzzy.
Okay, well, think of it this way. Snaffle bits are like a direct line to your horse's mouth. When you pull back on the reins, that pressure goes straight to the bit, which sits on the bars of their mouth. They're generally the go-to for beginners, or horses with sensitive mouths, because the pressure is pretty straightforward.
Okay, so direct and clear. Makes sense why those are good for starting out. Now, I've heard people talk about how different bits can affect the horse's pull, but I'm not even sure I know what that is exactly.
Yeah, so the pull is that area right behind the horse's ears, where their head connects to the neck. It's a really sensitive spot with lots of nerves, and some bits can put pressure there as well.
So we're not just thinking about the mouth, but also how the bit impacts the horse's head and neck.
Exactly. It's a whole system.
That does add a layer of complexity.
It does, and it's really important to think about, especially for occasional riders. You know, we might not have the same refined hand movements as someone who's in the saddle every day. So understanding how the bit distributes pressure can help avoid any accidental discomfort for the horse.
That makes total sense. So we've got snaffles as the direct line. What about leverage bits then? They sound a bit more, I don't know, intense maybe.
Yeah, they can be. And that's why it's super important to understand how they work. So leverage bits have shanks. Those are those long metal arms that come down from the mouthpiece. And those act like levers. So they multiply the pressure that you put on the reins.
So instead of a direct line, it's more like we're using a tool to amplify the pressure.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Leverage bits usually also have a curb chain. It runs under the horse's chin and attaches to those shanks. When you pull back, that curb chain engages and adds pressure to the chin groove and the pull.
Okay, I'm starting to get why leverage bits are considered more advanced. There's just so much more going on in terms of where the pressure is. So why would a rider ever choose a leverage bit over a snaffle?
Well, sometimes you just need a little extra oomph to get your message across. Certain disciplines, like Western riding, for example, often use leverage bits for more precise control, especially at slower speeds. And some horses, as they get more training, might respond better to those really subtle cues that you can get with a leverage bit.
So it's not about, like, being harsh or anything. It's more about that subtle communication.
Exactly. But with leverage bits, you got to remember that a little goes a long way.
Yeah.
Improper use can cause discomfort and even injuries. So it's really important to have the experience and skill to use them properly.
Hearing you say that just makes me think leverage bits are something I'd want to approach with caution. As an occasional rider, I'd probably want some expert guidance before trying those out.
Oh, definitely. I'd always recommend talking to a trainer or an experienced equestrian before even thinking about using one. They can look at your horse, assess their needs and your riding skills, and help you figure out if it's the right choice.
Yeah, I'll stick with my snaffle for now.
Yeah.
So we've got these two big categories, snaffles, that direct line, and leverage bits that are amplifying the pressure. But then I know there are tons of different types of each of those.
Oh, yeah.
Where do we even begin to unpack all that?
Well, let's start with the snaffle bits, because even within that direct line category, there's a surprising amount of variety. And understanding those nuances can make a big difference in your horse's comfort and how they respond.
Okay, let's do it. So for an occasional rider like myself, what should I be looking out for when it comes to those different snaffle bits?
So one of the first things to consider is the thickness of that mouthpiece. A thicker bit is going to distribute the pressure over a wider area, making it gentler on the horse's bars.
Okay, so if my hands aren't as steady as a professional rider's, a thicker bit would be a little more forgiving.
Exactly. It can really help prevent any accidental pinching, especially if you make a less than perfect rein aid.
That's good to know. I like the sound of that. So thicker generally means gentler. What else should we be looking at with snaffles?
Another key factor is whether the mouthpiece is jointed or straight. A jointed snaffle has that break in the middle, and it allows the bit to kind of conform to the shape of the horse's mouth. It can be a lot more comfortable for some horses, especially those with low palates or sensitive tongues.
It seems like it would also just be a bit more flexible, with more movement, which would make sense for someone like me who isn't always super precise with my hand movements.
Yeah, that's a great observation. It lets the bit follow that natural movement of the horse's mouth, so you reduce the chance of any pinching or discomfort. Now, straight mouthpieces, sometimes they're called mullen mouths. They don't have that break. So they offer consistent pressure across the whole tongue, which some horses prefer.
So it's almost like we're choosing a bit based on our horses, like mouth personality. Some might like the flexibility of a jointed bit. Others might prefer that steady feel of a mullen mouth.
Exactly. It's all about finding what works best for each individual horse. And that's where observing your horse's responses becomes super important.
Okay.
But before we get into that, there are a couple more things to consider when you're looking at those snaffle bits.
All right. What else should we know?
So we've talked about the thickness and whether it's jointed or straight, but we also need to think about the material of the bit. Some common ones are stainless steel, sweet iron, and copper.
Oh, yeah. I've seen all those at the tack shop.
Stainless steel is really durable and easy to clean, while sweet iron and copper, they tend to encourage salivation, which can make the bit more comfortable for the horse.
Oh, interesting. So the material can actually make the horse salivate more?
It can.
Why is that important?
Well, salivation is good because it helps keep the horse's mouth lubricated. That way the bit can slide and move more easily. And it helps avoid any friction or discomfort.
So a bit that encourages salivation would probably be good for, an occasional rider like me, since I'm not always perfect with my rein aids.
It could help, yeah. And then there's the texture of the mouthpiece, too. Some snaffles are smooth, others have twists, bumps, even rollers.
Wow, it's amazing how many variations there are.
Right. And all those little variations can affect how the pressure is distributed and how the horse responds to the bit.
So we've got thickness, joints, material, and texture. That's a lot to think about. How do we know what's right for our horse?
Well, that's where observation comes in. Horses are really good at nonverbal communication, and they'll tell you a lot through their behavior.
So we need to learn to read their body language.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not just picking a bit and hoping for the best. We need to really pay attention to how they react.
Absolutely. If your horse is happy and comfortable with the bit, you'll see relaxed ears, a soft mouth, and a willingness to move forward freely.
Okay, that sounds good.
But if they're uncomfortable, you might see some head tossing. Maybe they open their mouth, try to evade the bit, or even get tense in their jaw and neck.
Those are pretty clear signs. But, I'm not sure I'd always pick up on the more subtle stuff.
Yeah, it takes practice. It can help to spend some time observing your horse on the ground first. Just notice how they hold their head naturally, how they move their mouth, what their general demeanor is like.
So get a sense of their normal, then we can compare that to when we're riding.
Exactly.
And we shouldn't be afraid to try different bits, right?
Definitely not. It might take a bit of trial and error to find the perfect fit.
Trial and error, but with careful observation. Makes sense. Now, before we move on, you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to ask about. Bitless riding.
Oh, yeah.
Is that really a thing? Can you ride a horse without a bit at all?
You absolutely can. It might sound surprising, but it's a totally viable option, especially for horses that have sensitive mouths or for riders who are interested in a gentler approach.
Wow, I had no idea. So how does that even work? If there's no bit in the mouth, how do you control the horse?
Well, instead of using pressure in the mouth, bitless bridles work by applying pressure to different points on the horse's head, like the nose, the poll, and the cheeks.
Interesting. So you're kind of steering them from the outside in?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
So it's still about communication and pressure, but it's just applied differently.
Exactly. There are all sorts of different styles of bitless bridles, though. Each one has its own unique pressure points and ways of working. One popular style is the side pull. It puts pressure on the sides of the horse's nose. It's a great option for horses who are transitioning away from a bit, or who just prefer a lighter feel.
Okay, so side pulls are all about gentle guidance on the nose. What other kinds are there?
Then you have hackamores. They use a lever arm to apply pressure to the horse's nose and chin, so they offer a bit more leverage than a side pull. But you still need to use them with a soft hand, just like any leverage bit.
So even though they're bitless, they still use leverage?
Yeah. What else is there?
Another option is the bosal. It's a traditional bitless bridle used in vaquero horsemanship. It's made of braided rawhide and fits over the horse's nose. It applies pressure when you engage the reins.
Oh.
Bosals are known for their subtle cues and responsiveness, but they do require a skilled rider to use them well.
Wow, so many different ways to communicate without a bit. I'm learning so much. But I imagine choosing the right bitless bridle is just as important as choosing the right bit, right?
Oh, absolutely. Just like with bits, you have to consider your horse's individual needs and preferences and pay close attention to their responses.
So we're always watching and listening to our horse.
This whole conversation has really made me think about the communication aspect of riding in a whole new way. It's not just about the equipment. It's about understanding how our choices affect our horse
That's a great point.
and how willing they are to work with us.
Exactly. It's all about building that partnership.
Well said. Now, I know we've talked a lot about choosing the right bit or bitless bridle, but I'm wondering about the actual fitting process. Is there anything an occasional rider should know about making sure the equipment fits properly?
That's a really good question. Because a poorly fitted bit can cause all sorts of problems. It can be uncomfortable and even lead to behavioral issues. It's just like with us. We wouldn't want to wear shoes that are too tight or too loose. Horses need their bits to fit just right, too.
So how do we know if it fits right? What should we be looking for?
There are two main things to consider: length and thickness. The length of the bit needs to be just right, so it rests comfortably in the corners of the horse's mouth. You want to see just a slight wrinkle.
Not too tight, not too loose.
Exactly.
Goldilocks. What about the thickness?
The thickness needs to be appropriate for the horse's tongue and palate. If it's too thick, it'll be uncomfortable. And it can make it hard for the horse to close their mouth.
So bit fitting is kind of an art form. Any tips for those of us who might not have the trained eye for that?
If you're not sure, the best thing to do is talk to a professional. An experienced equestrian can help you assess your horse and make sure the bit you choose fits comfortably and correctly.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Speaking of expert guidance, I'm curious what you think about the role of trainers and instructors when it comes to choosing bits.
Oh, they're so important. A good trainer can be a huge help. They can observe your horse, watch you ride, and really give you some good advice. They can help you figure out what type of bit will best suit your needs and your horse's preferences.
So it's not just about going to the tack shop and picking something off the shelf.
Definitely not.
It's about having that conversation with someone who really knows what they're doing. And a good trainer will teach you how to use the bit properly, too. Because it's not just about the equipment itself, it's how we use it.
Right. It's all about communication.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like learning any new skill. Having a good teacher makes all the difference. But even with expert guidance, I think there are things we can do on our own to keep learning about bits.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially as occasional riders.
One of the best things you can do is just educate yourself. Read books, articles, watch videos. There are so many resources out there.
Yeah, there really are.
The more you learn about the different types of bits, how they work, how they affect the horse, the better decisions you'll be able to make.
So be proactive. Don't just wait for someone to tell us what to do.
Exactly. And the learning never stops. Even experienced riders are always learning new things about bits and bitting.
I love that. It's a journey of discovery.
It really is.
So as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, do you have any final thoughts or advice for our listeners, especially those who might be feeling a little overwhelmed by all this information?
I think the most important thing is to remember that choosing the right bit is a process. It takes time. You need to learn, observe, experiment. It's all about finding what works best for you and your horse.
So no magic bit.
Nope.
It's about understanding those principles of communication
That's what it's all about.
and applying them thoughtfully.
Exactly.
Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I'm curious to hear your perspective on something. How does the choice of bit influence the overall partnership between horse and rider?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it gets to the heart of what good horsemanship is, the bit, or even going bitless. It's just one piece of the puzzle. But the real magic comes from combining the right equipment with clear communication, mutual respect, and a genuine desire to understand our horses.
Beautifully said. It's about creating that harmony between horse and rider.
Yes.
And the bit is just a tool to help us do that. It really is amazing how something so seemingly small can have such a huge impact on the horse and on how well we can communicate with them.
It really is. It speaks volumes about how sensitive and intelligent horses are. They feel everything. And the right equipment, it can really help us fine-tune those signals, create a more harmonious conversation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of horse bits,
Mm-hmm.
what would be the one big takeaway you want our listeners to remember, especially for those of us who, only ride occasionally and are still figuring all this out?
I think it all comes down to this. Knowledge is power. The more you understand about bits, how they work, how they affect your horse, the better decisions you can make.
Right.
So don't be afraid to ask questions. Talk to the experts, experiment a little. You'll find what works best for you and your horse that way.
I love that. It's not about being intimidated. It's about embracing the learning process.
Exactly.
And learning to really understand our horses.
And the tools we use to communicate with them.
Well said. With that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the world of horse bits. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time, happy riding.